Welcome to the Green Talk. I'm your host, Misraim Mata. In today's episode, we are joined by Patrick Anderson from Rainbow Ecoscience, arborologist changing how we think about green spaces and landscaping. Patrick blends the art of landscape with the science of sustainability, using native plants, changing techniques, and cutting-edge technology to build and maintain landscapes that give back to the environment. Patrick, welcome to the Green Talk, man. How are you doing today?
Good, very good. Thanks for having me on. It's a long-time listener here. That's very
Thank you for being the show, Patrick. Long time. I don't remember last time we talked, but it's always good to have you and or talk to you. So let's talk a little bit, Patrick. We know, it's not new for everyone in the industry that something is going on, is changing with our planet, more specific to the climate, right? Weather conditions are changing. The patterns are all over the place, from wildfires on California, extreme heat on Midwest, tornadoes, storms like Helene last year, ice storms, snowstorms all over the place. So, Patrick, in your opinion and your expertise, how these changing climate patterns are affecting the strategies for tree and plant healthcare?
Yeah, well, it's again, to kind of emphasize that we've been in a changing weather pattern for sure, and obviously, you and I live in the Southeast, so we've seen some really extreme droughts here over the past, 10 years plus now. And we've had some really interesting things where we've had these mild, wet winters. So that brings a whole other kind of dynamic into what we're looking at here. And then combine that also with, we have a mild, wet winter, but then we have some extreme cold events. And this year was one of these years too, where, we had a relatively mild winter, and then we had a few weeks that were, below freezing, below temperature averages that we've had, that also stresses out plants. And so, you look at trees, specifically with trees react to things slowly. And so, they can't react when we have an extreme heat event or a drought event. They can't respond very fast to that. They have acute responses, right? But these are like added stresses to these plants. And when you think about where we're planting things like trees and shrubs, they're already undergoing some stress, right? I mean, they're not adapted to be growing in these suburban urban infrastructures that we're putting them in. And so you have a plant that's already put in a stressful situation, that these things are resilient so they can stand that for a long period of time. But then you start adding in things like, extreme heat, long periods of drought, and then things like, these wet winters that then allow things like these different root diseases to take hold, combining with these abnormally cold temperatures, and then you're left with a plant that is just really starting to starve itself for resources. And that's, I think, where we can intervene. Now, again, I don't want to paint a message of doom and gloom. This is where we as professionals can and should be intervening with these trees. So, that's
no, great. And you cover a little bit, or you say something about the drought situation on the Southeast. So focusing more a little bit on that, how these strategies can, new strategies to kind of design landscapings or gardens. So how landscapers can keep this a big factor under consideration. For example, in my area, we didn't get rain for like 2 months at all, like zero. And, irrigation, it gets to the point where it's hard to keep it up, right? So, in your experience, how the designing or new landscapings, or maybe renovating what we have already, keeping this huge factor under consideration.
Yeah, no. So like many things too, it's not an easy answer, right? And one thing too, I think that we all have to remember is there are multiple strategies, and a lot of times these strategies need to be integrated with one another. So If we're talking about planning, and ideally this is where, again, an arborist or a landscape professional like yourself, this is great. If we could get in on the plan, if we can get in the side of the design before we're left in a reaction phase, that's going to be ideal. And so some of these things we can think of with resilience and drought are the number one thing for all these is probably going to be soil preparation, right? And so we know a lot of times in development, we're going to have to be removing a lot of the topsoil, a lot of the A and O horizon that tree roots want to grow in. But if we can get there before we start planting the trees, we can do things like soil remediation or soil profile rebuilding. That was a process that Dr. Susan Day, when she was at Virginia Tech, was working on, where you literally go through and you use, at this point, you're using a backhoe to dig into the soil deep, um, amending it with composted organic material, some other amendments, and then literally like dropping it back down to kind of recreate those soil horizons. And again, by incorporating things like organic material, the use of things like biochar and some other amendments, these are things that can actually hold on to soil moisture for longer periods of time, which combined with irrigation, like as you mentioned, irrigation would be part of it, can help to make these plants be more resilient in these areas for a longer period of time. That's the ideal, getting there beforehand. Now, you also mentioned, though, in some cases, we're not, I don't want to say left with, right, but we inherit landscapes. That's like, I'm sure you deal with this in your day to day, right? You kind of inherit a landscape. And so this is things where we need to be maybe even look to be more innovative in some cases. So irrigation's part of it. There are strategies where we can try to rejuvenate that soil by using things like air tools, like an air spade, which would use compressed air to fracture compacted soil. And again, we could take a soil sample, understand what is lacking in that soil from let's say like a nutrient standpoint, amend with compost, properly composted organic material, things again like the biochar, as I mentioned, that will help to hold on to soil moisture for a longer period of time, and use that as a tool to kind of help rebuild soils. The other thing to think about too with mature plants are things like using tree growth regulators. And of course, they work by reducing the above ground top growth in plants. And I know you've already had one set of guests that talk a lot about plant growth regulators. So, you can go back and listen to that episode. But one of the cool things about using these plant growth regulators with things like the active ingredient paclobutrazol is it actually increases drought resistance in trees. It helps the tree to respond faster to drought-like conditions. So again, integrating these different things, right? Bringing in smart irrigation systems, amending the soil so that it's going to be more conducive to both root growth as well as holding on to soil moisture for a longer period of time, combined with things like using a tree growth regulator to help the plant itself respond to these things, are ways to help trees through these long drought periods. So
Exactly. So you covered pretty well the soil health, and I would like to talk about the tree regulator, growth regulator. We had a good conversation with an awesome conversation with Jason and Francisco about plant growth regulator. It's pretty much the same thing, but we didn't cover trees. We can talk about a little bit more about that. But what about native plants, native species when become long term success on landscape?
yeah, great question. So, native species. So, and let's take a step back and think about what native even means sometimes, right? So, if you go into a forested area, whether it's, down there in the low country or, up in the foothills or something like that, you're going to find various types of plants that are growing naturally, right? And they're adapted to that ecosystem with the other plants that are there with them, and again with that, that the historical weather pattern, right? That's part of what would dictate what is growing in a native area. In some cases too, you might find one set of species on, let's say, the eastern side of the mountain range, and a completely different set of species on the western side of a mountain range. So, even just dynamics around, where the location is in an area play on what is a native. And so we obviously, we want to look to native species from the standpoint of, from a climatic adaptation. These plants are native to the soils, are native to the area. So thinking of natives first is a great first strategy. And again, now, I'm going to say this probably a gazillion times in this, is we need to think of things as like an integrated approach here. So while looking at things like our native trees is a great first step, first good place to look, we also have to consider that where we're planting these trees, especially in heavily urbanized areas, you might have, a forest, right? Like right next to a development, and the dynamics are completely different, right? Where you have a forest with, again, a lot of different strata of plants, you have dead, decaying, and dying matter, you have certain soil type, versus, maybe not more than 100 yards away where you have a development where, again, you've removed that O&A horizon of soil. Now you don't have integrated strata of plants, right? You don't have like tall plants and medium plants and short plants. You have like bare flat ground with a lot of reflective heat. And so that plant that's doing great over here in the woods 100 yards away might not be the right choice for that area that we've now kind of created as like a non-native environment. So again, we want to think of a full plant palette. So what do we have at our disposal, and what might work really, really well in this area that we've essentially kind of made an alien environment. Now, I can stop there if you want, or I can keep on going. The nice thing about the natives is, because when we think about trees, trees are not only these beautiful things that we can enjoy, but they're little ecosystems unto themselves. So with native plants, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of help rebuild an ecosystem or maintain a native ecosystem. So, you have certain species of, insects that are specialists on plants. And we usually think of insects as maybe in a negative context, but a lot of these insects are beneficial. Pollinators, butterflies, right? These things are beneficial. Things like, we often think of caterpillars devouring leaves as a negative, but a lot of those caterpillars devouring leaves provide food for, our songbird species that I'm sure, many of our clients, in large developments or, in nice homes, they want their songbirds, right? So having native trees allow us to kind of maintain this native fauna that then, provide us other benefits. So that's where, again, I always like to say, looking at native first is a good place, but then in some cases too, that native tree might not be great for that urbanized area, in which case maybe we'll look at a tree that's not from that area. Now, it could still be from, the political boundaries of the state or the United States, but not necessarily native to that area. And then likewise, there are also some good species that might not even be from North America that might fit better in that area, given, of course, again, what is the intent of the site and what else is going on. So again, looking at native first is great, but keeping in mind that when we're planting these trees, not necessarily their native environment, right? So looking at it from all aspects to make sure that the landscape's successful is going to be
No,
important.
it is a very great point, because while I hear you talking about that, I just remember very often, with my family, with my wife or my son, and then we saw a beautiful, just for example, a beautiful southern magnolia on the woods, healthy, no scales,
Yep.
green, beautiful. But then you go to an apartment complex and you have a magnolia tree next to a hill tree building, full scales, suffering, who knows what kind of soil being planted. So perfect example of what you just explained. So not because it is a native means that you can use that everywhere. You have to keep in mind the whole big picture, environmental factors involved when it becomes using this species on the area. That's what you're saying, right?
Absolutely. And that's, perfect example. That's a great example, right? Southern magnolia, native plant. We often think of plants that can grow, in low areas as good urban planting. So that's one, you can find that growing in low areas. So that's a good, that's the reason for that is plants that grow in low areas can withstand low soil oxygen. And of course, in an urban environment, we have low soil oxygen. So again, it's a great place to look to start. But then in that example, right, you're going to get nailed by all kinds of different scale insects. You guys also deal with things like black twig borer. So you're dealing with boring
Exactly.
insects and these things as
Yeah.
well. The poster child for me is red maple, where red maple, I mean, you talk about where it grows from Florida to Maine. It grows in highland sites. It grows in lowland sites. I mean, you think about it, objectively speaking, it checks a lot of boxes. But when you stick it in the landscape, man, oh man, it gets nailed by things like gloomy scale, girdling roots, poor branch structure, right? I mean, it's just kind of, so objectively speaking, it checks a lot of boxes, but then when you place it in this alien environment, it might not be your best choice. So, yeah,
Right.
it's a
Perfect. Now that's awesome, man. That's a great point. And before we move forward, I would like to talk about a little bit of the tree growth regulator.
yeah,
Um, um, More specific, Cambistat. And so Jason and Francisco did a great job explaining the benefits and everything about using trim tech on plant shrubs. But what about Cambistat? How Cambistat and tree growth regulator can help landscapers facing this challenge on the actual green factor, or no factors, like the actual challenge in the green industry?
yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, thanks for asking. So, using things like Canvastat. So, do a brief review of how it works, right? So, Canvastat is applied to trees or tree form shrubs, so larger plants, let's say trees specifically. It's applied as a low volume soil application right around the base of the tree. So no need for foliar applications, things like that. Again, it's low volume right around the base of the tree, which makes it a very easy thing to apply. So the way it works is it blocks how it achieves growth regulation, and why it's again marketed and labeled as a tree growth regulator. The way it works is by blocking the hormone that's responsible for cell elongation and expansion. So when you make a soil application of Canvastat to the base of the tree, it moves its way up through the vascular system into all the leaf, the growing tips or buds up into the canopy where that hormone is produced, and it goes to work. So it's blocking that hormone that's responsible for cell elongation and expansion. That's how we get growth control. So from a landscape maintenance perspective, one, of course, if you have trees growing next to infrastructure, signs, lights, what have you, awnings, you can prune the tree to where you're not in conflict with that infrastructure, apply a tree growth regulator, and for about 2 to 3 years, you're going to have reduced growth. So reduce the need to come back and prune. So that's obviously a huge benefit to, those of us managing landscapes, right? You don't have to prune as often. And again, clients are happier. That's probably the biggest thing, really, is we're not getting
Yeah.
the complaints as much. The other thing here is when we talk about growth regulation, we're regulating all primary and secondary meristematic growth, so both tip growth and diameter growth. So here, if you're thinking about trees that are growing in a boulevard or in a tree well, or again, maybe in a small courtyard, not only are we reducing the tip elongation, the branch growth, but we're also reducing diameter growth. So again, this would be the width of the stem as well as the width of those buttress roots and woody roots. So from that standpoint, too, we have less likelihood. Well, I shouldn't say less likelihood, but we are going to reduce the time in which we have issues with sidewalk heaving and cracking and some other infrastructure damage as well. And then likewise, if it's in like a tree grade or if there's something growing around that tree, we're going to reduce the time for that stem to grow in conflict with that infrastructure there. So that's some of the benefits for us just from a practical standpoint. But then we get into some of these secondary health benefits. So as a side effect of these things, we actually have beneficial side effects. So the first thing that you'll see is you actually see the trees will begin to become greener. And so there's a few reasons for this. One is some of the molecules in the plant that go into producing chlorophyll also go into producing chlorophyll. So did I say that right? Some of the molecules that go into the plant that go to produce that growth hormone also go into producing chlorophyll. So if you're reducing the amount of growth hormone in the plant, some of those molecules go directly into chlorophyll production. So you see darker, greener leaves.
Okay.
That's one of the things you see. And you see that almost within a year of application, you'll see these trees green up. So if you have trees that are chronically yellow, that's one way to kind of help these trees survive in these areas. The other things we see is that we see an increase in defense compounds in these plants. And this goes into this idea of like the tree energy budget theory that Dr. Dan Herms wrote about when he was at The Ohio State University. And it basically talks about, hey, trees are collecting these resources and they have these different energy buckets they have to place them into, one of those being growth. And so if you ask the plant, hey, don't put so much resources into growth, it can then take those resources and put them into these other energy buckets. And things that we would be interested in are things like increase in defense compounds. And there's data to back this up. You can see that plants that aren't growing as fast have more metabolites in them and some of these other phenols in them that will help to combat disease. The other thing we see, and this is when we start talking about plant resilience with things like drought and things of this nature, is they can also store more energy. So think about how plants produce energy. They produce energy through photosynthesis. If you're in a drought, the plant is not going to be transpiring water as much. And so if it's not transpiring water as much, it's not getting CO2. It's not the pores on the leaf surface will close. Those stomates will close. And so you're not collecting CO2, which means you're not producing energy. And so using a plant growth regulator, you help the plant to actually store more energy. So from a resilience standpoint, if you're going through an extreme drought, the plant still has to survive. I mean, it still has to have those leaves, right? There's still things, while plants look like they're not doing anything, just kind of sitting there. They're doing stuff all the time, right? And so if you're not producing energy, then you're using stored energy. And so by using Cambistat, you help the plant to store more energy. So again, from a standpoint of that resilience issue when times of drought, or even you mentioned, not to get all over the place, but you mentioned things like hurricanes. We had Helene come through. We lost a lot of branches on those plants, right? So the plant has to replace those branches. By having more stored energy, it can help to do that and not be such a drain on itself. So that's one of the things from a resilience standpoint we can do. And then lastly, to kind of top off the drought conversation, again, we see that when we apply Cambistat, the plants become more resilient to drought as well. They're able to actually respond to drought faster. So we mentioned the fact that the stomates close during drought. Well, the signal begins in the fine roots. And so when you apply a tree growth regulator, other hormones are kind of being released in the plant. And in this case here, a hormone that helps the plants respond to drought, we have more of that. And so plants respond faster to drought. That is, so they close off those stomates sooner so that they don't lose as much water. And then we also see in this case too, that just the cells themselves begin to respond to help to hold on to more water and things like that. So that's kind of all the great things that Cambistat can do to help trees be more resilient, as well as help us as landscape
Yeah.
managers to maintain them for a longer period of time.
That's great. Great information, and this is pretty much the part of the new technology that it is available for landscapers. It's just being smart, using what it is available to help. Obviously, help the company, help landscapers, but also more important, help trees, plants to survive the new environmental challenge that we all are facing. And you know trim tech for shrubs, the application is foliar, for the most part, can be also be applied on the ground or drenching or injection. Cambistat is more like only root injection, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Ground.
Root injection with a probe, or you can do a drench out of
A drench.
a bucket. So just dig a little moat and do a drench out of a bucket like that. So
And it can be applied to pretty much any species of tree. What about palm trees? No palm trees?
great question. So in general, it can be applied to just about any tree in our landscapes. Couple of exceptions. One would be cornus species, so dogwood species. Very, very sensitive to this. And so we don't recommend the application to cornus species at all. There's some other species that are sensitive to paclobutrazol. Now, Cambistat, both our label as well as our supplementary information provide a lot of guidance around sensitivity of species and how to make these applications. So that's one thing you can take solace in, is that we have a lot of information, data, background on how to make these applications be successful. Now, the other thing you mentioned there was palm trees. And so this is where we kind of start talking about the difference between good growth regulation while at the same time having secondary health benefits. So things like palm trees and like pine trees as well, and our other coniferous species, like let's say junipers or leyland cypress, we don't see great growth control, and it's probably because of how they grow. They kind of have like really like determinate flushes of growth. They don't have these like indeterminate flushes of growth like a lot of these shrubs and some of these other trees that we deal with.
Yeah.
But we don't see great growth control with those. And when I say that, I mean like if we're talking about an oak tree, I would say you're going to get probably like 70% growth reduction. So if that tree grew 10 inches in that year, it's only going to grow 3. With something like a pine tree, I would say you're probably going to get maybe like 25 to 30% growth reduction. So likewise, if it's going to grow 10 inches, it's probably still going to grow like 8 inches, right? So
Right.
it's there, it's just not as great. Now that being said, same with palm trees. We don't see great growth regulation on palm trees. However, in our data with palm trees, which we've never published, so you can't really look this up, and I apologize for that. But in our unpublished data with palm trees, we do see green up of new fronds. So again, just like when you would do fertilizations, use those newer fronds that you would see the green up on. So you see green up of new fronds. Just like with our conifers, you see new needles look darker green. Real quick, going back to some of our conifers, things like leyland cypress, cryptomeria, some of our junipers and arborvitae, and of course, I'm speaking. I know you have a national, maybe an international audience, and I'm speaking with a little bit of an East Coast bias, but those plants are often planted as screening plants, and they're often not necessarily planted in the best conditions, and so they can get secondary issues like certain canker diseases. And
Mhm.
this is where Cambistat can play a role again to help them be more resilient in some of these poor planting practices that we do for a good reason. Screening is good. Green walls are beautiful, but there's a set of management techniques that we want to employ with those to keep them looking that way. So, and that would be a good option for you there.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. That's awesome, man. Just for the record, yes, we do have people listening in Australia and Londres and recently in Japan as well.
Right on, excellent.
Yeah, so we need to start digging into those environments as well and making some recommendations. Oh, in
Yeah,
South America as well, South America. But no, thank you for explain more about Cambistat and how that can help us in the field to be better and help our environment or system. And I know, Patrick, you are all over the place, traveling across the country, west, south, northeast. And in your opinion, what's the most common mistakes that you see in a landscape when it becomes planting or planning landscape designs that when you saw that, I said, "Oh man, this is really horrible." how we can how we can suggest people to avoid those maybe common, easy ways to fix something that can become like a huge issue for a tree or shrub.
yeah, great question. So the most common issue that I find, well, and again, I'll break this down into two things. There's like a design factor of it, right? And sometimes, shoot, we just see the wrong tree in the wrong place. And I mean that by either, you have this like maybe cute little conifer that's like this big, but it's going to be 100 feet tall one day and 60 feet wide, and it's planted like 5 feet from some piece of infrastructure. That's probably one of the biggest things I see is just kind of uh, the design. While it looks great now, it's going to be a real pain in the future. And then some of the things we mentioned as well, right? Like just planting. Gosh, I'm not going to say because I don't know for sure, but I hear one state is still planting things like ash trees, right? And we know the emerald ash borer is on the march, and it's just, oh goodness, right? You're asking for problems in the future. So that's one of the things I see with design is probably just not really thinking about what the future will be for that plant. Installation and planting, and I know you see this all the time too. It's trees being planted too deep is probably the biggest thing that we see. And so I'm sure a lot of your listeners already realize this, but again, to go back to like how a native plant looks, if you walk out into the woods, you're going to see all these trees that have a flare at the bottom of them. And so that flare, that root flare or root collar, whatever nomenclature you want to use, that is adapted to be above ground. And so when you put that underground, that bark is not adapted to be underground and have excessive soil moisture against it. And so that bark can break down. That can lead to things like canker diseases, again, which we realize are bad. It can just lead to just breakdown of the bark and the vascular system in that area. It can lead to things like girdling roots, which are bad. And then finally, one of the things that we see on from time to time is that plant will kind of plants respond, right? So it senses, it knows that its root collar is buried, and so it sends out the secondary root system, which will keep the leaves healthy, but that primary root system might decay away and have, again, decay into the stem, and then when we have wind events, a perfectly green, healthy looking tree might fall down because of poor planting practices, a decade beforehand. So that's
Right.
it's probably the biggest thing I see.
What about volcano mulch?
Volcano, it falls right in there too. Yeah, thank you for my. Yeah, I mean, just I don't. I mean, I guess I don't know. Sometime, somewhere, somebody decided that having mulch like 3 feet up the trunk looked good. Don't quite get it, but volcano mulching is a big thing too,
I
and
hate that.
and this is when I say properly mulching a tree. Literally, properly mulching a tree is probably the best thing you could do from a plant healthcare standpoint. I often joke if your plant healthcare program is nothing but properly mulching a tree, it's about the best thing you can do. But that volcano mulch is about one of the worst things you can do. So
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Actually, yesterday I got a picture. I saw. I mean, it is incredible. I mean, it is like I don't know, probably 2 feet of mulch above the ground, covering almost half of that tree. I mean, I feel so bad for that. I think it was a live oak.
yeah,
Uh, I mean, it's horrible, but it's what it is, unfortunately.
it is
But
what it is.
hopefully, at some point we get there and people will start changing the way. I mean, I feel like education, knowledge, and hopefully more people talking about the right way to do it. I would say in the past 5 years, maybe or maybe more, you know, new generation of landscapers, people just incorporating into the industry, thinking that landscape means only mowing, edging, and blowing, and they start doing planting and just without the proper knowledge, it's just becoming more popular. All these issues that are minimal or maybe small, but create a lot of issues.
Big issues in the future. And if I may share just one quick anecdote about this, I recently read a book. It was called The History of Arboriculture in England, and which was a really dry book. I actually don't recommend it. It was really boring. But no offense to the author, he's listening. Anyway, there's an anecdote in this book, and it goes back. I think it was like sometime in the 1840s, and the person in their quote is talking about how trees planted too deep look terrible, and it's like we've been talking about this for like 200 years now, and it's still something we're talking about. So it's
We'll see. Hopefully that change promptly in the near future. So now we have let's say we have a landscape already established. It is struggling. It's not looking good. We have a lot of things going on. In your opinion, how someone, landscaper or homeowner, can approach the restoring or changing some of these issues, not issues, but like the design, the planting of the landscape, just to kind of help to improve the health and aesthetic of the landscape in general.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, this is one of these things where it's going to be an integrated approach to this, right? So, first thing first is identify what the trees and shrubs there are, right? Knowing what the tree species is, what should be normal for that species, knowing what pests and problems are likely to affect that species, can then help to dictate like what that plan would be, right? And so that's one thing to look at, is just understanding what the species is, how it should be growing, and then what problems we can foresee to help us start putting a plan in place from that standpoint there. The next thing after that is, again, turning to the soil. So first things first, making sure, if it's a tree or even a shrub, making sure that, it's not buried as we described, right? So first thing I would do is, if that root flare, root collar, root transition zone is buried, um, uncover that. That would be step one in that. Um, Step two would then be to see what can we do to alleviate any issues in the soil. I'm a big advocate for soil samples. I think that will help a lot when it comes to helping this tree in the long term. We can make some assumptions. And again, if you've worked in an area for a long period of time, you probably have a good idea of what soil chemistry is. But that being said, it's really going to start there with that soil sample. So we can take that soil sample, and then that can help us understand what type of soil management program we might need to put in place. So that would be from that standpoint. And then again, compaction is probably, again, one of the other biggest things. I kind of said that the poor planting or planting practices might be the biggest thing I see, but the next thing to that is definitely compacted soils. Again, go back to the idea of where the majority of the plants that we're planting in our landscapes have adapted to be a forested environment. I mean, go out into the woods sometime this weekend and dip your hands in the soil. And again, it's not necessary. I mean, you can grab a handful of soil, right? I mean, you can usually do that. Try to go to a new development and do that, right? It's not gonna happen the same way. So doing things you can do to alleviate soil compaction, that might be as extreme as, again, as I mentioned earlier, using something like an air tool, like an air spade, to decompact that area. That's one of the best things you can do if it's severely compacted, and then stir in this composted organic material. But if that's something you can't do, then again, this proper mulching over time, and it could take some time, but over time, mulch will reduce bulk density of the soil. It'll bring back in, as it's decomposing, as soil organisms are moving in, it will be broken down and kind of introduced into that soil. So that's one of the big things that you can do there, is just, get proper mulching. So those are things you could definitely look at for an established landscape. And again, for something that's maybe still under the establishment phase, that's a great opportunity to start looking at what plant species would do good for your area. There's some great lists out there. Some municipalities have recommended planting lists. I know a friend of mine, professional arborist, just went through and did a review of a municipality up here by me's planting list, and took, going back to this idea of changing climate, took some of these species off the list that are probably not going to do good in the long term, added some new species onto that list. So kind of look at these updated planting lists for recommendations and ideas of things you could be putting into your landscape.
Yeah, oh, definitely, and a lot of work for sure to trying to fix something that has been struggling. And this kind of remarks the idea of it is always better to do the right thing at the beginning when doing the design, the planting, put the effort there, so that way, and the long-term success or long way. Obviously, we're gonna face something, right?
Yeah.
It's not gonna be perfect, but at least less issues, less problems in the long term. But great approach. Thank you, Patrick, for sharing that. And what about the philosophy of working with nature rather than against it?
And
What do you
yeah,
think about
again,
that?
because nature's always going to win. That's it's just a matter of when, right? And so that's it. That's, again, going back, not to kind of use the same answer and over again, but that's where, again, knowing what your site is and then adapting it to species, right? Like, if you have a site that is going to hold on to water, like, don't plant a white pine there, right? That wants to grow on the side of a mountain in the Appalachians.
Yeah.
That's crazy. So working with what the landscape is giving you is going to be really crucial, because even in these difficult to grow areas, even if we have like extremely dry spots or extremely wet spots, there is something that we can put in that spot, right? And so working with what you're given, maybe there's some augmentation that you can do or maybe should do, but working with what you've been given is going to go a long way in the long term. It's going to save you a lot of frustration for sure, or at
Yeah.
least the homeowner. And again, fellas like us, Mizram, that inherit these landscapes. It's going to make us a lot happier. And so the other thing too I wanted to say though is going back to some of this stuff is also keep in mind plant diversification. One of the things, especially in our urban forest, that has caught us time and time again is this planting the same species over and over and over again. And, again, looking at plant diversification so that, when the next pest comes, which we can't predict, right? Nobody was going to predict things like Dutch elm disease that came and wiped out hundreds, if not thousands of miles of roadway elm trees. No one was going to predict that. We came back and we replanted them with ash trees. No one was going to predict emerald ash borers are going to come through and basically do the same thing again, right? So we can't predict what the next thing is going to be. So making sure we have a very diverse plant palette in our landscapes is going to help us in the long run as well.
Right. Oh, that's great. And do you have any like top 3 or top 5 underappreciated species of trees or plants that can help or serve as ecological roles in the landscape? Like you say, this is my favorite. This is my top 5.
Gosh, so asking a plant person, or at least self-described plant person, what their top 5 trees are or plants is like, God, who knows, Miz, what I'm going to come up with? But I know
It's this is a personal question, Patrick.
sure, yeah, it's a personal question.
What's your most favorite trees or plants?
So if I'm thinking specifically for an urban or suburban landscape, so let's narrow it down for me, right?
Yeah.
I
Only
do
you.
think I think there are some pretty cool trees that we don't use very often in landscapes that we could be using that are native. So I think we have some pretty cool native oak trees that, again, if we have enough space to put in our urban suburban landscapes, I think would be really cool. I think overcup oak is one that we could be looking at. That's Quercus liriata. Would be a neat one. Again, that's native to the East Coast. Should do well in some of these poor oxygen soils. And also the acorn is interesting. It's called overcup oak because the acorn kind of cup comes over the actual nut there itself. It's really neat. I think swamp white oak is another one, which would be really neat. Again, as the name implies, swamp white oak, it can grow in these low oxygen areas. Where it has been planted in the landscape, it looks like it's doing really well. And again, the cool thing about oaks is they support a lot of diversity when it comes to some of these, species like caterpillars and butterflies, which will then go on to pollinate things in our yards and in areas around us, and also supporting that bird population. So there's neat things unto themselves. I really like bald cypress as well. I think that's a really good one. Now, this is a one that I really like. I think in the right spot it does really well, but this is a good example of a tree that is thought to not have very many pests or disease problems, but as we're putting them into our landscapes, we're seeing more issues with scale issues. So I think that's something to be looking out for. A non-native that I think would be a good one. I don't know what it does exactly for species diversity, but ginkgo is a real tough plant. Would do good in maybe some really difficult growing conditions where we can't put maybe some of these other species, and has just great fall color. So you have that going for you. And I guess, well, few more since you left the door open. That was what, 3? Maybe I get one more. For smaller plants, maybe ones that aren't going to get as large. I think some of our native hornbeams and hop hornbeams would be really cool. So Carpinus and Australia. Again, these are ones that can grow in low soil oxygen environments, but seem to be pretty tough plants with few issues for now. But those would be some neat ones as well.
Oh, great, man. Great recommendations. I mean, bold cypress are one of my favorites for sure.
Yeah,
actually, I was about to ask you what was the most common disease or insect or something going on, because every time I saw bold cypress, looks pretty good, awesome, healthy. And
yeah.
I'm going to look for scales, though. Probably if I look closer, maybe I'm going to find scales, something like that.
Especially if it's growing in where I see it most often is where people are putting them in parking lots now. I've seen more in parking lots.
Yeah, parking lots. Yeah.
And that's where they see, just you look in those branch tips and look for the little Lacanium scale or Fletcher scales.
Okay. Oh,
Easy to
great.
treat
Thank
though.
you.
We can treat it. It's fine.
Thank you for
So,
sharing your list.
yeah.
Appreciate it. So, Patrick, before we put wrap up this session, any advice from Patrick Anderson to new generation of arborologists, landscapers, just overall people that maybe hearing this podcast and either they are already in the industry or kind of thinking the way out or whatever it is, any advice in general that you want to give to our listeners?
Sure, yeah. So one I'll state with, I'm a big advocate for the green industry. It's been good to me. I love it. I've made some of my best friends in this industry. I've just had just such a great time in this industry. The people are great. The work is great. There's very few jobs you can do where at the end of the day, you're usually leaving the world a little bit better than it was beforehand. So I love being an arborist. I love working with landscape professionals. I think it's great. And so if you're new to the industry, my recommendation is just keep with it, keep on learning, find mentors. Um, you know, don't be afraid to ask questions. And the other thing I love about this, right? There's always something new to learn, and you know, there's things are always changing. There are things that I learned as a fact when I was in college that now is no longer true. So
Yeah.
have an open mind, and just have a lot of fun with it. If you're maybe you're an intern, or maybe you're just like, I gotta get a job, I'm gonna get a job mowing grass, maybe you're just kind of starting out, you don't know where to go, I would say the same thing. Again, this is a great industry to be in. And the other thing, there's a lot of diversity in this industry, right? I mean, here we are doing a podcast. Who knew you could host a podcast being a landscape professional, right? Whether you like plants themselves, the actual physical work of maybe pruning or mowing, or install, there's a path there. Maybe you're more into people and meeting new people. There's a path with business development or sales that can be real rewarding. Maybe you're a gearhead. Maybe you like logistics. There's a pathway in operations if that's where you want to be. I know, Mizram, you have a passion for like technology, and so I mean, there's roles where you can help with technology and things. We
Yeah.
have consultants that go do GPS tree inventories and do data analysis that way too. So there's a lot of things you can do in this industry. So I think a long way to say, um, there's a lot of opportunity in the green industry. It's been very rewarding for me. Get to meet and hang out with people like you, and
Thank you. Same here.
there's keep an open mind, and there's always something new to learn. So yeah, there you
Great
go.
advice, Patrick. Thank you, man. I appreciate it. And thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing a little bit of your knowledge, your experience, your expertise, recommendations to our listeners. I'm sure that many people will be benefit of everything you just talked about in this episode. So I appreciate it. Good to see you again, and hopefully to sit down pretty soon and just share a drink or something like that.
Absolutely. I need to make myself back down there. So that's
Thank you, Patrick.
thanks a lot. Have a
See
great
you
one.
soon.
I
Bye.
appreciate it.